Indigenous Peoples Day. Good to see you all. So wonderful to see so many familiar and friendly faces here in this audience. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. I'm Angela Riley. I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and director of the Native Nations Law and Policy Center here at UCLA School of Law. I'm a professor of law and American Indian Studies and special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous Affairs, along with my co-special advisor, Dr. Shannon Speed here. So it's really wonderful to have you all. I'm going to be very brief because I want to get to our main event as quickly as possible. I did want to start by just doing our land acknowledgement and acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of this region. For us here at UCLA, it is the Tongva peoples, and we appreciate so much them allowing us to be on this land today. And also just want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples all across America, the Americas, and the world who have endured and been resilient survivors of colonization and so much for so long, but we are still here, as you can see. So, miigwech. As you know, we're here today to give an enormous thanks and debt of gratitude to the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. And thanks so much, the tribe and their team, some of whom are here today. So thank you all. I'm not sure where everyone is, but thank you so much, San Manuel, for this generous gift of $2.2 million, which will allow our Tribal Legal Development Clinic to continue to flourish for another 5 years as a full-time, year-round clinic serving the legal needs of tribes in California, the U.S., and even some of our international work beyond. So please join me in thanking San Manuel. This enormous generosity and the faith that our tribal partners have in the work that we're doing here at UCLA has really been transformative for our program. I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Carol Goldberg, who will be here in a little bit but isn't here yet. But as many of you know, Carol spent decades building up this program and really being the vision for it and got it to a place that when she handed it off to me, I always tell her it just makes me look good because I was able to just step into the work that she'd done for so many years. So we're so appreciative of her. And like I said, you'll be able to see her at the reception where she'll say a few words about the beginning of the clinic and how this whole journey sort of really started. I also want to give a moment, we've had a few of them over the course of the clinic's life, but I want to just give a special thanks to Micah Durandi, our clinic director, who is and a thanks to all of our Native Nations Law and Policy Center team who's all here today. And thank you to my students, so many students who are mine and other people's students who are here. Thank you for being the reason for all of this because you are brilliant and committed and just have so much positive enthusiasm for what can be done in Indian country. And but for you, none of us would be here because we're here to help you get the education you need to go out into the world and become lawyers and fill all other kinds of roles and to serve tribal sovereignty and Indian people. So thank you to our students as well. And with that, I'm so delighted that we have our guest speaker here, Dorothy Alther from California Indian Legal Services, but I'm going to allow our wonderful, supportive Dean, Michael Waterstone, I'll invite him up to give the formal introduction. So, Dean Waterstone, thank you.
Thank you, Angela. My name is Michael Waterstone. I have the honor of being the dean here, and not one of you came here today to hear me speak, so I'm going to keep it very brief. But certainly, we do a lot of events here. Hi, Carol. One hallmark of a successful event is a full room and good energy, and boy, we've got that. So already off to a great start. We're certainly proud to be hosting you all here today on Indigenous Peoples Day. We have this incredibly special relationship with the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. This has spanned 2 decades and has made a substantial impact on the lives of countless UCLA Law students and across Indian country. This year we have another reason to celebrate and share our profound gratitude. As Angela mentioned, thanks to its most recent gift of $2.2 million, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians is continuing its visionary support of our incredible Tribal Legal Development Clinic, which is part of our Native Nations Law and Policy Center. So I'm going to quote from the announcement of this unbelievable gift, because I really think they got it right. The clinic fosters the next generation of tribal lawyers by connecting students directly with tribal leaders, officers, and attorneys to support tribal sovereignty through the provision of legal development services to Indian tribes. Often students travel to Indian country to meet with tribal clients, to collaborate, deliver work products to governing bodies, and participate in relevant meetings and hearings. This contribution funds the full-time and year-round work of the clinic, including the clinic director, clinic administrator, summer law clerks, and various program expenses. In so doing, it fuels UCLA Law's work in producing new practitioners and scholars who work in Indian law or whose work intersects with issues involving tribal sovereignty. So thank you. This funding also makes today's guest lecture possible, and I know our community is going to benefit from hearing from our guest speaker and other Indian law practitioners going forward. We have a crushing access to justice gap in this country. And as a law school that was founded with a mission of public service, we have an obligation to make a difference. So I'm really pleased to say thank you to a few people that made this possible. They certainly include, but are not limited to, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Chairwoman Lynn Valbuena, the Tribal Council, and Tribal Leadership. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dorothy Alther. So Dorothy is a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe and the legal director of California Indian Legal Services, which has served tribes and Native peoples across California since 1967. It is one of the most respected legal service providers in Indian country. Dorothy's work focuses on impact litigation for federal Indian law matters, assisting tribes in building tribal governmental infrastructure. Specifically, she has helped tribes with tribal court and law enforcement development, with establishing or revising tribal governing documents, and with building tribal program law. As an advocate for tribes and tribal communities on state and federal rules and legislation, she helps advance laws that protect and enhance tribal governments, and helps provide community information and awareness on critical issues that impact California tribes. We are incredibly honored to have you be our speaker today. Please come on up. Thank you.
Wow. Am I on?
Yes.
Am I on?
Yes.
Oh. Well, thank you. Thank you. What an introduction. Can you see that? Come on. I've got great photographs in this
The
thing.
lights down.
The lights, there's too much lights on
Oh, it took me forever to figure out how to put those pictures in the PowerPoint. I want you to see them. Okay, well, thank you for what a wonderful introduction. And I'm happy to be here with my hero, my mentor, the woman I admire so much, Carol Goldberg, who I frantically call, Carol, just see that public law in any case, and who's always been there and helped me in my litigation in the area of PL 280. And so I love it, Carol, and Micah, wherever she's off doing. So anyway, when I was getting ready for this, I was saying, well, who's my audience? What do they want to hear? And so in just sort of talking through that, we were talking about maybe what it looked like when I first started, which was just a couple years ago. But no, I've practiced for about 40 years now, okay? And it's all been Indian law. And it's all been pretty much Indian legal services. So we thought it might be helpful to kind of talk about what it was like when I started. And then kind of talk about what's going on today. And what's probably more important for you is what's waiting out there after I retire. Okay. So, let's see here. sucks getting old. Shut up, Richard. I know you're out there laughing. Okay, can I move this? All right. This doesn't seem to be working. Ah. All right, so I just pushed the little arrow. I knew that. Okay, I thought that I would start just telling my story. And, I'm not going to bore you with, all the details. But I wanted to give you a sense of where I grew up. Because I'm a member of, as I mentioned, the Oglala Sioux tribe. That's in South Dakota. And I always love this map because it is a picture of all the reservations in South Dakota. You see that little block where it says Pine Ridge and then it says Rosebud, that little area right there? That's where I grew up, okay? And it was never clear to me why you would have that little tiny piece of non-Indian land pretty much surrounded by Indian reservations. Later learned as an Indian lawyer that that was actually part of the Pine Ridge Reservation. But it was opened up for public occupancy, and so it was eventually found to be enough non-Indian to be pretty much its own county. So that's where I was born and raised, and that's what it looks like where I was born and raised. And I put dances with wolves, and then I realized no one in this audience, other than us older people, will know what that is. It was a movie from the 90s. It's a great movie, okay? It made me homesick. I was crying. That's it, okay? And as you can imagine, when winter comes and you're in, 50 below wind chill factor because there ain't a tree around that's going to slow that wind down. But anyway, it's big sky country, and it was my home, and that's where I grew up. And keep this in mind because I later moved to Washington State, and you can imagine the trees drove me nuts. But now you'll know why. Anyway, so this is where, when I was growing up, it wasn't cool to be an Indian, all right? Pine Ridge, which is where the Indian Health Hospital is, where the tribal government is situated, was an extremely depressing place. There was extreme poverty, and so when I was growing up, Indians were sort of stereotyped and kind of kept not a lot of intermixing with the non-Indian community. And then in 1973, when I was very young, I was in high school, okay, AIM came to town. And the American Indian movement took over Wounded Knee. And it was the first time that I had ever seen that many law enforcement people in one place. Now, the takeover started in the winter. And you can imagine it's a little cold in about February in South Dakota. And so there was a huge standoff. And there's no place to stay in or around where I grew up. It's not like you're gonna go to the Residency Inn in Pine Ridge or to, the Holiday Inn in Rosebud. You're not. You're gonna end up staying in Martin, South Dakota, which is where I grew up. That little square. And I was a waitress at the 24-hour truck stop at the time. And one of the things that I noticed is I didn't know this at the time, it was just a lot of cops in town. But we had federal marshals, we had the FBI, we had the National Guard at one point, we had, of course, local sheriff, and we also had tribal law enforcement. Now these were all the people that came out to put down the rebellion, the takeover. Well, they all stayed in Martin, all right? And they like to drink their booze, and they like to eat steak, being good beef country. So every non-Indian in Martin, South Dakota raised their prices for alcohol, for staying at the hotel, for you know, you name it. Every price in town went up. The people in Martin were hoping that you know, occupation went on for the next 2 years because they were making money off of it. And I always find it interesting because that's never a story that's ever told, because it was all about the occupation and what they were fighting for, and when you're growing up there and you sort of see this other side of it. And I grew up in a very non-political, non-traditional Native home. We had no idea why they were out there. We thought they were stupid in the sense that it's cold. It's really cold out there. And we did have friends who were ranchers around Wounded Knee. Well, they cut the access to Wounded Knee. They stopped at Martin, South Dakota with a roadblock, and then they stopped it on the other side of, I think it was Highway 18 or something. Anyway, you know, it was cold out there, and they wouldn't bring food in, right? So they would sneak out at night, and they'd butcher a cow. Now, coming from ranchers, a lot of the local ranchers, most of them Indian, are like, look, if you're going to kill my cow, the least you can do is know how to butcher the damn thing, okay? So the ranchers weren't real happy about the takeover because they were losing cattle. But it was an interesting time in the sense because at that point forward, it was cool to be an Indian. Everybody wanted to be an Indian. Everybody was in for the cause. Suddenly it was, when I was growing up, there was a household joke, I guess, that when we got our Black Hills money, we were gonna get that wash machine and dryer. We were gonna get that car. We were gonna get that pickup truck. Now it took on a whole new meaning, okay? And I was actually in a program called Upward Bound at the University of South Dakota, and to see the students in that program with me, all Native American, all from Pine Ridge or Rosebud pretty much, and seeing that they were now extremely proud of being an Indian and ready to fight. And it was inspiring. And so for all of what AIM was and wasn't, my experience from that point on was that it really brought about a new understanding of being an Indian. At least in South Dakota. I can't speak for those Navajos outside. But in South Dakota, things changed, all right? There was a different attitude. There was a real change among younger people and some of the older people. Because one of the big one of the things was AIM was gonna put Benedict County back on the reservation. We were like, oh, okay. But that it was also fighting for treaty rights and sovereignty and a lot of other issues. Now, I will tell you, as someone who grew up there, that is a very mixed background. There are people in Pine Ridge who are not big AIM supporters, so I will leave that to rest. My point was, this was really the start of something big, I thought. So I'm just going to skip forward. I did want to point out that my family moved to LA under the Indian Relocation Program, and it was quite the experience. Growing up in Martin, South Dakota, population 900, and the first place we came to in LA was Watts. And we lived there for a brief period of time, and then they moved us. And I'm not sure exactly. My husband is in the audience. He is also from LA. So when I talk about living in LA, he's always trying to figure out exactly where I was. But we then ended up in Downey. And then my siblings rebelled and said, we're going back to South Dakota. You guys, the rest of you can stay here. I loved it. I would have stayed here forever. I hate cold weather. I hate cold weather. I loved California. But anyway, we moved back. I went to the University of South Dakota. After college, I moved to Albuquerque. Did not spell it, but I was going very close to the Southwest, where it's nice and warm. Anyway, and all of that, I ended up at Northeastern. In Boston. That's where I went to law school. And one of my first jobs out of law school was I worked for DNA Peoples Legal Services, which is, you know, I always say the Navajo Reservation, but I probably shouldn't because it's Eastern Agency and it's not part of the treaty reservation. But anyway, I'll just say the Navajo Reservation. And this is a photo of the staff that we had in Crown Point. And it was a real adventure, okay? And I was telling Carol this, that, you know, when I speak to law students who are interested in Indian law, I've always said, if you want to do Indian law, you gotta live where there's Indians. It helps, okay? It helps. And so I found myself in Crown Point, New Mexico, which is really, it was a very isolated place. You know, they don't know the closest grocery store that go to do your laundry is 60 miles away. They did open a laundromat and then realized they had no water. But it was a very challenging job. Now, in Indian Legal Services, we represent individuals. At DNA, we did not represent any tribes, okay? All of our clients were individuals. And what brought me into Indian Legal Services was really just the legal service part. Because the reason I wanted to be a lawyer was I wanted to help poor people. That was my driving passion, is I wanted to help people who could not afford a lawyer, who get screwed over by people who do have lawyers, okay? So that was where my passion was. Well, somewhere along the line, someone told me, you know, they have Indian Legal Services. And I truly was baffled. I mean, like I said, I didn't grow up, you know, in a political family or anything. And so the more I started looking into it, it was like, wow, this Indian law stuff is kind of interesting. And I just met for about an hour or so with the professor who teaches federal jurisdiction.
Of course.
Yeah, I love that class in law school. And anyway, you know, I just sat and got to talk to him about, you know, jurisdictional issues because I loved it. I was just such a nerd. Loved civil procedure, you know, all the classes everyone complained about. I really enjoyed those classes. And I gotta tell you, as an Indian lawyer, I probably got more out of my federal court, federal jurisdiction class than anything else. But at Northeastern, we didn't have a lot of Indian law classes anyway. But, so that was how I got started in Indian law, was I wanted to be a legal aid lawyer. I wanted to be a poverty lawyer, public interest lawyer. Well, then I fell in love with Indian law. Then I found Indian Legal Services, which was the perfect fit. I got to represent for Indians, and I got to do Indian law. And I've been doing it now for a very long time, very long time. So, while I was at DNA Crown Point, I met my husband, he is from California. He worked in our office, and so when we were thinking of moving to back to California for him, I was like, but there's no Indians there. What am I gonna do? I know. But us Plains Indians, they were the only real Indians. And then you go down to Navajo, and they really think they've got the market on being Indians. And I was just very ignorant. And a position popped up in California Indian Legal Services Bishop office. Everyone know where Bishop is? On your way to Mammoth skiing, you stop there and get chat spread, and then so anyway, I moved out here well, he wasn't my husband at the time. I was just following, and took the bar exam. I was scared to death. I mean, I took the New Mexico bar in the Rabbit Poultry building at the state fairgrounds, and so I figured the state New Mexico or the California bar was probably going to be a little bit more challenging. But anyway, had a lot of support again from my then boyfriend with helping me get through the California bar. So anyway, I moved, and this is a fabulous picture if you could really see the dynamic of it. That's what I drove, I moved to Bishop, and that was what I drove by every day to work, okay? And so anyway, lived there for quite a while, got married, had a baby, and then got a call from an old DNA attorney friend of mine, John Sled, up in Washington, working with Suquamish tribe. He said, come on up and work with me, Dorothy. And I'm like, oh, why not? I just had a baby, and So I did. And I went in-house as the Suquamish tribe's attorney. Now, remember that picture of Dances with Wolves? I didn't do well in Washington. There were a lot of trees, and I found that it was a little difficult, and plus the weather. Anyway, so we decided to have another baby up there, and then we moved back to California, back to Bishop. But during that time, okay, and what I was finding now that I was in Indian Legal Services, and I've done this presentation thing before about what was happening in the 70s. Remember, we're talking about AIM, and there was the federal policy, Indian policy, all shifted. Remember, there was kind of terminate. I'm talking now to the Indian students. You remember that? All right. So we're moving out of the termination, and we get into self-determination. And there was a lot happening during that time period. Remember, I was saying in '73 when AIM was really active. And what I found was the parallel between the Indian Self-Determination Act really kind of taking off in 1962, and with the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Indian Financing Act, ICWA, Indian Self-Determination Act, paralleling that over to what was happening on the more radical side, okay? This is legislation. What's happening? We have Wounded Knee being taken over in 1973, and then we have Alcatraz being taken over, again in, the early 70s. So things are really moving. Things in Indian country, in my opinion, were getting shaken up a little bit, all right? And the courts were active too. We have McClanahan versus Arizona, state income tax, tribal member income, can't do it if you're on the reservation. That was a DNA client, okay? The woman, the plaintiff in this case, the Navajo plaintiff, worked for the National Bank or something on the reservation, came to DNA Peoples Legal Services and said, I have to pay $16.20 in state income tax, and I don't think I should. And the DNA, Indian Legal Service lawyer, said, I agree, let's just challenge the Arizona Tax Commission. So anyway, Oliphant, again, not a lot to say about Oliphant, other than when I practiced in Suquamish. I gotta tell you this story. I'm driving along on the reservation, and I see Oliphant Plumbing and Oliphant Brothers Plumbing, and I almost ran into the back of them because I was like, oh my God, that is the pivotal case on criminal jurisdiction, and they were plumbers. Anyway, so anyway, and the Itasca County dealing with PL 280 specifically, that was Leech Lake Reservation Indian Legal Services Project. So these cases walk into Indian Legal Services. They may end up going off to NARF. They may, as they make their way to the Supreme Court or something, obviously they're going to be retaining, much, more experienced Supreme Court attorneys. But this is the beauty of legal services, Indian legal services. That case had to start somewhere. And chances are they're not walking into a big private Indian law firm, because these cases were coming down in the 70s. There was no Indian gaming. Sorry. Every tribe in California was kind of poor and qualified for CILS services, all right? So this was just an exciting time. And like I said, you had, kind of the militant side of AIM and taking over Alcatraz. You had Congress passing some new laws, and you had the Supreme Court issuing some semi-okay decisions. And I do want to just toot the horn a little for CILS, is that, and you probably may have been learning about, the Rancheria Act, which was slated to terminate 41 tribes in California. They ran out of steam or something because they quit at 37. And now CILS we were established in 67. And it took us a while to get going. Of course, I wasn't around then. I was out in South Dakota freezing to death. But it was in this time period that CILS came into being and took on this litigation. And CILS, we were able to restore 27 of those tribes. And either through just straight litigation or settlement, there were 2 other restored through legislation. So again, these are cases where someone had to walk through that legal aid office door and say, this is wrong. And like I said, the attorneys that worked on these cases are some of the big named, established Indian lawyers in the state of California, okay? And so it's really, like I said, was such a time of change and litigation and also legislation. So anyway, this is kind of the past, all right? This is kind of gives you an idea of I think, an exciting time, a changing time. And I, of course, was coming in the late 80s, early 90s. And so where are we today with all this great energy and the legislation? It's been good. It's been good. I've got some good stuff. Got some bad stuff happening. But when I came back from Washington State, I came back to Bishop and I said, why are there no tribal courts in California? Because a big part of what I did for Suquamish was their tribal court work, AKA all criminal, because it's kind of a quasi-swazi kind of PL280 state, but not really. If Carol says, you know it's not true. But anyway, the 90% of what I did in tribal court was criminal, all right? And I was the worst. I was the worst prosecutor in the world. I would refer to the defendant as my client. If I lost a trial, I went back to the office and rewrote the criminal procedure code for the tribe so that this would not happen again. And it's my own fault, because when I started, there were no public defenders. I'm an old public defender type, and I was like, you really got to get a public defender. Not that the judge and I were like railroading people or anything. It's just, it makes it easier. So what do? They go hire the best 2 public defender types in Seattle. And they just came over and kicked my ass around the courtroom every time I can imagine. But they were very good lawyers. But when I got back to California, I just saw this need. And I kept getting calls from tribal people. This article was in 1995. That was my client. And I'm actually featured in the magazine. But I got a hold of a reporter. And she was willing to do a big article, a big spread about PL280 and tribal courts. And I hadn't even sort of gotten into law enforcement yet. But anyway, what it started for me in the early 90s and stuff was pushing for tribal courts, tribal law enforcement, because we talk about institutions. And Les Marston, a very well-known Indian lawyer, once said, I can't remember it exactly, but something to the effect, when you're using a white man's court and a white man's law, you're not exercising sovereignty, basically. And I thought, that's really kind of true. We're always in, a state court, federal court, whatever. Why not tribal courts? So anyway, in this particular case, this had to do with restraining order. And these are all state restraining orders. Couldn't get county counsel to come out and have the sheriffs enforce it if there was an Indian who the restraining order was against. So we have an Indian victim, we have an Indian abuser, restraining order on reservation in a tribal house. The sheriff would not respond. And so anyway, that's what started getting me really ramped up about this tribal court stuff. So kind of flash forward, and the other thing is that, when I do PL280 and tribal court development, I always say, you gotta have 3 C's: courts, cops, and codes. All right? And so one of the things in all the court development that I was doing was I saw a need for tribal law enforcement. Okay, so I got all involved in that. I'm down in our San Diego office. And one of the areas that I became furious about was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs will not fund tribal courts or tribal law enforcement in PL 280 states. All right? And what they told us was that, hey, and I understand this, they get a very small bit of money and they've got to divide it up amongst all the tribes across the country. They are going to make non-PL 280 tribes more priority because they have to do it all. I mean, I've practiced in non-PL 280 states. There is no sheriff. You ain't calling 911, okay, for the sheriff to come out. But the issue for me was that it was just a policy. Now I'm pulling my AP, Administrative Procedure Act. There was no public notice. They promulgated a rule without public comment. Okay, that was one of my arguments. But what we were really trying to do was force the hand of the Bureau to actually fund tribal law enforcement in tribal courts. All right, and we litigated, and I won. I actually won at the district court level, and it went up to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit was very nice. Actually, the first 3 pages I was reading, I thought I won. But what the court said basically is, we feel your pain. It's just we can't help you. You have to go to Congress. This is a funding issue. And we can't get involved in telling the BIA how to fund law enforcement or anything else. It's an appropriation without any limit or direction. So, I spent the next few years trying to get a legislative movement going in California and it hasn't really happened, but there has been some movement. There has been some movement. When it comes to courts, we do now have the BIA doing these legal or tribal court assessments, and that brings in some money. But a lot of it is seed money. Tribal law enforcement can get money through the COPS grant to build a tribal law enforcement department, but then there's no money to fund the law enforcement department after the grant is finished, which makes no sense given the fact that you now have a department and you can't run it because you don't have any money. So anyway, that's kind of the dilemma in the state of funding issues with law enforcement. But some of the issues, and I'm just going to tick this off. I've only got an hour, right, Micah? Okay. I'm just going to run through these kind of quickly, but this is kind of where we are today, and I'm speaking from Indian Legal Service, kind of, I'm sure that there are other issues out there, but a real fallout from termination that we have ran into is the Supreme Court Carcieri case, which now says that in order to take land into trust, the BIA needs to determine whether or not you were under federal jurisdiction in 1934. And I'm sure all the students know what happened in 1934, right? Okay. And so when tribes that were terminated, okay, and then later come back to seek land into trust, it becomes a real historical evidentiary nightmare to try and establish whether they in fact were under federal jurisdiction in 1934, okay? And so this has been somewhat challenging for a lot of the terminated tribes in establishing being under federal jurisdiction in order to get land taken into trust. The other thing is CILS just updated a 1990-something water study that we did. And this also comes up as a water issue of establishing winter's rights, if you've gotten to that yet in your classes, where they're talking about when the reservation was established, what was the purpose? What was the, well, what's the triggering date for a terminated tribe? Is it the triggering date for water rights when it was first recognized as a rancheria, and then got terminated, or is it when they got or unterminated? So these are kind of some of the questions. We deal a lot with the Latis, who also have some of these questions that ended up with lands coming out of that termination period. And then I just had to put these up here because these are the things that are happening today in Indian law. In ICWA, we all know the Brackeen case. We're pulling our hair out. Oh my God, it's going to unravel all of Indian law. This was the famous ICWA case that went up to the Supreme Court. We didn't know what was going to happen, but it was a very good opinion. It held for, the ICWA that being Native American was a political classification, not racial, blah, blah, blah. But then we have this lovely quote in a concurring opinion from one of the justices that says, I join the court's opinion in full. I write to emphasize that the court today does not address or decide the equal protections issue that can arise when the Indian Child Welfare Act is applied in individual foster cases or adoption proceedings that have to do, where standing is not an issue. Because in the Brackeen case, standing was an important reason too, why the case was ultimately, it added into the arguments that the individuals did not have standing, therefore the case should not have even gotten as far as the Supreme Court. But the plaintiffs in this suit, if they had standing, that perhaps equal protection is still alive and well, though that challenge to the ICWA. And what that kind of has left us with is, so are we going to see another challenge to ICWA coming up through the courts, this time with someone who has standing? So that will be a challenge. And then this one, of course, put me over the top as well. And I don't even need to read the whole thing. This court has long held that Indian country is part of the state, not separate from it. Under the Constitution, states have jurisdiction to prosecute crimes within the territory except when preempted by federal law. I read that and I'm like, I just can't believe that a Supreme Court justice would say that. Because as Indian law students here, we all learned the martial trilogies, right? And one of them that kind of stuck in my head was, the Worcester v. Cherokee, which held basically that there is no state jurisdiction at all in Indian country. All right? And other than PL 280, there really is, in the area of criminal law, very, very little state jurisdiction. So reading that this court has long held in Indian country being part of a state and is not, I was like, I don't know, how this could possibly be written based on everything I have learned about Indian law. And so what I think that, oops, so I'm going to have to wrap here, but so that's kind of where I've been in the last 40 years. So what can you guys look forward to? And I don't know. I just put up their challenges with this Supreme Court because I think it's going to take a lot of educating, And that's what you do as an Indian lawyer. You walk into courtrooms, especially ICWA cases, it takes CILS into every county in the state, right? And you can walk in and I do have to laugh, because it does give you a special status. It's like, oh, the Indians, the tribes lawyers. And so you can just pretty much say what you want and everyone's going to believe you, right? Because there's no one in there to say, that isn't true. But, my point is that you do spend a lot of time educating people. Oh my God. And not just courts, legislators. They want to get me started. But anyway, there's going to have to be some real working with this Supreme Court, I think. And so, anyway, the other point I want to make, and this is very, very, very different from when I started. Tribes have real diverse legal needs. They have become very sophisticated, okay? And there is a place for just about any lawyer in Indian law at this point. Usually it was like, well, you got to do public interest to be in Indian legal services or kind of come in from that. Not now. Tribes need tax lawyers. Tribes need corporate lawyers. Tribes are moving into off-reservation development, which creates all kinds of labor, I'm not going to say labor law, but issues with HR, okay? All right, if I'm on the reservation, I can say, well, California Labor Code doesn't apply. Boom, done. Don't even think about it. Don't put it in your HR manual. Well, now you're off reservation, okay? Okay, maybe we should look at that California labor law, okay? I'm not going to learn it. I don't care. I'm not a California labor lawyer. I never will be. Go hire one. And if you get sued, I'll come in and file a motion to dismiss for lack of subject matter jurisdiction because you have tribal immunity. But up to that point, hire a California labor lawyer. All right? The goal is to stay out of court. The goal is to not get sued. If you do, call me, okay? Cannabis and banking. The only reason I get involved in this is because the tribal officers I work for have a special law enforcement commission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That means they have to enforce federal law on the reservation. And as we all know, weed is still on Schedule 1. You guys probably don't. But it is. So I get the call from the tribal officer on the reservation who has the SLEC say, what do I do? The chairman has just now opened a dispensary. And you know, I can get around the law enforcement issues, but in terms of figuring out the whole licensing of the state, I know it's civil regulatory, it doesn't apply, but guess what? If you're gonna sell unless, you know, you're gonna sell it all on the reservation, you're gonna have to interact with the state. I don't care, I don't wanna learn that law. You know, and of course there's always building, you know, infrastructure and institutions. But I guess my point is there's a lot of Indian work out there to do, and it doesn't have to be sort of this traditional treaty rights or, you know, well, there's no treaties in California. All right, think of another example. You know, it doesn't have to be this pure Indian law that, you know, and I don't have any problem saying, you know, I don't do copyright law. Call a copyright lawyer. You know, because sometimes, like I said, tribes really have a lot of diverse issues coming in that aren't strictly, purely Indian law. They may have a layer of Indian law, and that's where I can help, but they're coming in a lot of different areas that I don't practice, and I'm not going to pretend I do. And I'm not going to bill my client for learning it, okay? So I just really want to stress that no matter what you're interested in, tax law, whatever, there may be a place for you in Indian law. But all of it comes down to maintaining sovereignty. No matter what they do, it always comes down to you are a sovereign, and you have the rights to make your own laws and to, you know, enforce those laws. And even if you're going off reservation, even if you're engaging in diverse economic development, at the end of the day, there's still a sovereignty element to all of your work. Okay? Oops, sorry. All right, Micah, how do I get rid of that? I have to do this when my boss told me I had to. She said, put this up there. Okay. If anyone is interested in being on our board of directors, and we always love California Indian law students because you're poor. We need poor people. Anyway, I told her I would plug this. I'd put it up here. So with that, I'll leave that up there so you can do with it what you want. So that's all I've got, and it is right 4 o'clock. Oh, I think there was going to be questions. Oh, I should have given 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think this is good. If folks have any questions for you, I'm sure they'll find you out and about, but I think maybe one person had a question. We can definitely go there.
What's happening with Leonard Peltner? And why did you erase
You know
Russell
what?
Means
He
from history?
just came up again,
Yeah.
and he's dying. I mean, the guy is got medical problems. What is he, in his 80s, something
Yeah,
now?
Obama was supposed to, and then he reneged on it.
I don't know. I have no idea.
And why did you erase Russell Means from history? Wounded Knee in there. He was born there. One of the founders of American Indian.
Yeah, well, he was there. He's still around.
No, he died.
Oh, did he?
Yeah,
Jeez.
Russell Means.
Dennis Banks was
Yeah.
really the one that I think kind of after Wounded Knee tried to go on and be more, you know, building governments and things. I don't.
Well, Russell Means to the end, he said he was, you know, even when he became an actor, I used to run into him all the time.
Oh, really?
Doing his acting gigs or whatever. You know, and I wonder why was he in San Juan, in LA all the time, and he was doing all these movies.
Pocahontas.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm sorry
The
that we
He
don't
was
have.
born on a reservation.
Yeah, I know.
I'm sorry we don't have more time for questions. We want to get people situated and moving out to the Shapiro Courtyard. Again, thank you, Dorothy, for
Oh, it was fun.
for presenting, and we will start our formal presentation outside at 4:20. But feel free to mingle, get some light refreshments, and we'll see you out there. Thank you.